Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much. I can't believe that it's the first time I'm at such a conference because it sounds like it's the kind of crowd I should have already met a long time ago, and perhaps we have crossed paths. Um, I have, as you heard, recently moved to the area of sustainability and environmental policies, but have spent quite a lot of time already in digital government topics. So what I'm trying to do now is also see how these things can um, better interact. And that's what I've been asked to also talk about. So you'll hear me talk a lot about different nexuses, and the nexus will be kind of at the heart of what I try to explain today, or how we see it, at least from the European Commission's point of view, and how this twin digital and green transition can happen that the previous Commission mandate has already put forward. We'll do that digital twin transition, and I think we're still kind of thinking how exactly that happens. How do we spend that €1 that actually takes into consideration both the digital and the environmental and other sustainability aspects? Ram, you mentioned already sustainability. As you know, we sometimes talk about it in the context of the green and environmental sustainability. Sometimes you also mentioned it's also in the context of social cohesion. How do we ensure eradicating poverty? How do we make sure that there's access to education? But there's also the sustainability. I think you slightly alluded to it, Sarah, is in the context of our economic growth and competitiveness. And you'll hear that, and I'm sure you have in the current Commission's context. That's a huge emphasis. But when we look at in the two angles, and I focus a bit more on the economic and the green sustainability, we see that there is, in a way, some kind of maybe a conflict or some kind of disharmony between the two. So you obviously in terms of the objectives, sometimes it's short-term versus long-term objectives. I could even think about how some of the changes we need to see or we need to address in the economic growth and competitiveness are happening very quickly and with a much shorter timeline, whereas some of the changes in environment happen in a much longer, but then the impacts start to kick in, and the two timelines are going at a different pace. Then we also see a conflict. If you recall, in the previous Commission's mandate, there was a lot of legislation around the Green Deal that needs to be implemented. But of course, it also brings with it some kind of regulatory burden and to ensure compliance, to ensure reporting, to ensure that we have all the information about economic operators, but also the public sector complying. So how do we make sure that we go towards a competitiveness where we don't block small companies to report? At the same time, we make sure that they do follow and comply with our legislations. And then there can also be disruptions in supply chains. See, I need my glasses to this. Because we don't yet fully see that there's certain areas of the economy where we could see that, for example, circular economy could eventually, or we bet on the fact that it could be a profitable market segment, but still there's perhaps still blockage from venture capitalists to put money into something that is still in an innovative phase. However, we do see synergies between them. Obviously, it can create new market opportunities, and you've seen over the past decade or two the emergence of many efforts to create more renewable energy, electric vehicles, circular business models, and so on. Clearly, it can link to, or it can help in greater resource optimization, efficiencies. For companies, it can, but also for public administrations, improve their image or brand values, perhaps greater access to funding, especially in the EU, when companies put forward their contributions to sustainability objectives, and so on. And so what we can see is that clearly the two could really foster European resilience. And indeed, if I go a bit deeper, and you will hear this from the Commission's current mandate, there's a lot of, as I told you, focus on competitiveness for a number of clear reasons. You already mentioned, one of you, the energy prices, but also independence for energy sources. Obviously, there's a lot of new innovation coming out, for example, from China that we have not been expecting to that let's say, speed. And they're also able to produce at a greater scale than, for example, in Europe. And some of the market distortions are also pushing Europe to look at how we can still create a level playing field. At the same time, we also see there's challenges, obviously, the triple um, planetary crisis that we often talk about in the environment, and it's nothing new, but still the numbers are striking and actually are showing going towards even more striking figures. If you look at global extraction of materials, for example, it's tripled since 1970, and the waste generation will reach about, or will have increased by 70% by 2050. Or even biodiversity loss, huge figures there. And if you look at also, I don't know, planetary boundaries exceeded, we're going towards, I don't know, I'm sure your academics, you will have heard of the donut economy, which looks into how do we actually create growth within the planetary boundaries. Kate Roworth, I think her name is. All these challenges, and how do we actually, address them in a manner that we actually take benefit of or actually move forward on both. One side note that I wanted to mention is that when we talk about sustainability and the green transition, oftentimes we look at, yes, the greenhouse gas emissions and the CO2 emissions, but actually it's a lot more than that. I wanted to bring to your attention something that's also quite importantly on the agenda of the European Commission, is to how do we actually move from a linear production to a circular economy, and how do we detach growth both from resource usage and from the impact on the environment. And indeed, there's an understanding that for many of these triple climate crisis, if you want to call it, the main driver is the fact that our economy is non-circular for the moment. And we see that there could be a lot of positive benefits if we actually manage to move back to or to recycle more both the products and our energy resources for a number of reasons. And perhaps I show the other slide that can actually speak for itself. How could that work in Europe? So you will have seen the plans for a Circular Economy Act and the many initiatives to clean our industry, and then to actually try and see how we move from a product-based towards a more service-based economy, and how do we take it both, as I said, for the energy needed for the economy and the industry, but also how do we move the products back in terms of greater maintenance, repairability, and so on, back to use. Why did I say this? Is because it will be quite a bit under our radar when we talk about data for policy for sustainability. One thing I wanted to then highlight, and I hope this will cheer all of us up, is that it's considered that digital can be a connector between these conflicts in the terms of going towards a more sustainable economy and going towards a greener economy. So digitization can actually help in this nexus, if I go back to it. And I mean, I'm probably talking to the converted, but you will recognize that. I think I may have done something. Oh, it's back. Okay. Indeed, so with digital, we can monitor, and then eventually, with the help of digital tools, AI, reduce and optimize resources. We can come to greater cost efficiencies. We can also help better compliance with our legislation, which is also something quite heavily on the mind of EU policymakers at the moment. And how do we actually help better tracking of emissions, better automated reporting to demonstrate compliance with legislation. How do we monitor, for example, especially for this circular economy, the different steps in a supply chain by tracking and tracing of where different components come from and where do they end up? How do we can use digital for risk management, and then of course to assess, for example, environmental risks, and then get access to sustainable financing. How do we use this data for predictive analytics and foreseeing extreme weather events and so on? But also how do we support decision making with the available data for making those more sustainable decisions? And of course, there's even more potential for maximizing these synergies, because it can trigger greater innovation, more research in the field, foster data-driven decision-making, but also engage, I said customers, but the same way also citizens. What are the kind of skills we need, and how do we invest on those, and how do we actually scale these solutions? So if I look at the green and digital nexus, I think, as I said, the last Commission's mandate was a lot about this green digital transition, and it's still a priority, but somehow the interlinkage of the two is not yet a priority. So I was quite pleased to hear that this is something on your radar. And we'll be listening to the discussions later today and tomorrow on how you see it. And what is it that we could do at policy-making level to bring these closer together? There is little understanding of the interplay. If I look at the funding, this Recovery and Resilience Fund that Europe has launched after COVID, there were certain amounts, 30 and 40% to be spent on green and to be spent on digital, but it's very hard to see how they have been spent of some same euro on the same topic together. And some of the reasons for that, and it comes from the European Investment Bank, is perhaps also the lack of skills, and this is green skills and digital skills and the two together. Municipalities lack, almost 70% of them think they lack the climate assessment skills, and then also some of the digital skills, which is something I knew of. I didn't realize that, of course, environmental assessment skills are quite unique. Now, indeed, here again, you may say that it's in conflict if you talk about green and digital. I think the colleague from Hong Kong mentioned you looked into the greenhouse gas emissions of, for example, data centers or AI and cloud. And indeed, the ICT footprint is around 2 to 4%. Which can grow, and we know it will grow if we start putting in, cloud and edge computing with AI and data centers. But we also know, if you look at the synergies, that there is a potential for digital tools to reduce, for example, greenhouse gas emissions by 15 to 20%. So I think the point is, how do we make that potential a reality? How do we bridge that gap? Of course, e-waste, so it's one of the fastest growing waste category, and we know that because of greening, some of the digital technologies have been halted or blocked. Blockchain has its own reputation, although if we just talk about decentralized computing, we may see some other figures. If you look at single-use electronics or I said data centers and AI comes and goes, but it comes. Okay. But then again, we could see great synergies if we look at how, for example, this green transition can trigger more sustainable financing. And some of the investors that we talk to tell us that yes, the younger generation is ready to actually have their asset managed, with investing in green sustainable assets. And so how do we trigger that? How do we understand what to invest in, and how do we trust that data, for example, that goes into those assets? And then so it comes to the fact, okay, so what we do, and that's colleagues in another department in the commission, looking at how we can ensure that the technologies that we use are becoming more and more sustainable. So there's a lot of effort going into climate neutral and efficient data centers. Colleagues in DG Connect and DG Ener have come up with energy efficient directive, and then all these data centers will have to report their sustainability footprint, and there's efforts to actually go even beyond and perhaps identify some minimum requirements. We're looking into greener electronic communication networks, also circular electronics initiatives. So how do we reuse and put that back in the market, the electronic devices or lower processors? And you'll be pleased to know that the Commission will come out with an AI and Cloud Development Act later this year. And in that, in fact, the emphasis will be not just on European players, but also sustainable data centers for AI. And then I think I come to more to the angle that maybe you're more familiar with, is like, how do we see the contribution of digital to sustainability? You have already mentioned what did we talk about? I think we talked about this 15 to 20% potential. And there's many examples. Probably in the crowd, you know, what we talked about, or you mentioned that I have worked on digital twins. I'll talk about that in a moment, and we can talk also on the corridors later. Something I'm following very closely. The digital twin of the Earth, Destination Earth. You're nodding, so you may be familiar. But obviously, projects around smart mobility. One of the colleagues I talked to works on that. Digital product passport. It's more for the industry. So for a product, what we're working on is some kind of a wallet for a product that would carry all the knowledge about the different components. And there's many, of course, other examples. But for us, yeah, it's just an overview of like what we could do with digital for environment and how could we build it into our policies. So how do we use this data for monitoring when we know that a lot of the data that is required for complying with the legislations comes in every 2-3 years, every 6 years? So how is that useful for our policy making? How do we make the best out of it? Of course, that data can also help for greater transparency, resource management I mentioned earlier, eco-friendly products, compliance, and so on. I was thinking how to frame it also for this discussion. So how do we use this data for environmental policy making? And clearly, and I'm sure you've been looking into this, how do we use it in the policy making, for example, for forecasting, foresights, anticipations? When we talk about the digital twins, oftentimes they're used for operational decisions, in a city to direct, to make sure that you don't pass red lights or you have always the green light for your bike. But of course, it can also be used for more strategic, longer-term decisions and bringing all kinds of data together, creating scenarios and so on. How do we use, for example, data to see and even nudge behavioral insights? How do we use it for policy evaluation and impact assessments? That's something, I was saying this, I think, to Zeynep earlier, that the first time I heard of data for policy, we were looking at it for the Commission. How would we use all this data for our own policy making and impact assessments? I'm not claiming that we're there yet, but I think we do use a lot of the data. Obviously, we always have to make impact assessments for a new proposal, but there's a lot more road to be walked before we can really say that we have, structured use of that data that's collected for our own policy evaluations. And then, of course, this could also help in innovations in terms of human resource management systems. You will be familiar with all these aspects of how do we do that. I pull out, for example, the real-time monitoring. That's something that we're really looking into, how best to actually collect that data, in situ data, with Earth observation, satellites, and so on to actually um, inform our decisions, our policy making. How do we use data for greater planning, forecasting, as I said, but also for more automation. Um, for example, as I said, in the circularity, greater analytics and insights to patterns, to or even to detect, like the flooding we had earlier in the summer in Valencia, for example. How do we put those things into place and do it in Europe, which will need obviously cross-border data exchange and many other analytical tools that I'll talk about in a moment. So Destination Earth, for those that don't know yet, is something definitely worthwhile looking into. We add each time new services on top, so it's creating a digital twin of the Earth, and now actually has the possibility to zoom in quite even locally. So even for city services, it can be helpful. And we're looking into different use cases. Maybe you've seen the water resilience strategy published, I think, last week. They're also going to work with it and with Copernicus data as well to see how we can improve and optimize our water resource management in Europe. Local digital twins is another area that the Commission is quite actively supporting. We know that several cities now have one or the other form of a digital twin, or at least some way of monitoring what happens in the city and how they could optimize, as I said, mobility and air pollution and that combination of those and so on. By the way, the Netherlands is quite advanced in that. So especially, for example, I know in Rotterdam, they're even looking at the role of the citizen within the digital twin. You're nodding, so you're familiar. It's an excellent way of looking into the future, how these digital twins could then even consider the role of the citizen and their behavior in a city context. We have set up a so-called toolbox in the Commission that cities can benefit from. They come into a help desk and they checked for their digital maturity, and then the support service tells them, what are the kind of steps you would need to take to actually set up your own digital twin. We will help them implement an interoperable platform, help them with their data exchange. And then you can also use modular building blocks to build your own digital twin. At the same time, there is a collaboration between the digital twins across the EU in the context of let's say, a collaboration between multi-country project between member states. And we're continuing to fund some of these AI-enabled digital twins in Europe. I talked about the product passport, but perhaps it's interesting, I think, from a point of view of policymakers to understand, what kind of products do we allow to come to the market, and what should be the way we manage the knowledge about these products. Because there's certain ways of incentivizing environmental policy. Things don't necessarily happen just by themselves. There's usually the need for government to intervene. I also wanted to mention another European initiative that companies have pledged or made their commitments to go towards more sustainable digital solutions. It was started in 2021, and by now we have over 30 companies who have signed off with their pledges and to foster this sustainable digital solutions. And they have in fact come up with a methodology to monitor the, let's say, environmental footprint of these technologies, but then also work on deploying such devices and software. And then also together have come up with some recommendations, and there's some really interesting use cases that you can have a look. But also from the public sector side, there's a commitment from quite a number of member states that have pledged to move towards more sustainable governments, and some of the key elements linked to green public procurement and to, in a way, how to make that either a certain percentage or mandatory. They support the deployment of green digital solutions, and obviously look at the way how data centers go towards more sustainability. I'd like to now put it in all this, what I've just said, into the current Commission's frame. I already said that, this time around, the Commission is very much focused on sustainable prosperity and competitiveness. So indeed, that digital and green twin transition is expected to come out from there, but we also look at quality of life, sustainable quality of life, and global Europe, our role in the world. And with that, there's quite a number of initiatives. One of the first ones from the current Commission was the Competitiveness Compass, which really focused on, okay, what do we really need to do to pick up on competitiveness? And you will have seen that indeed clean industry, so decarbonization, is one of the top ones. It's also come out earlier this year. But then how do we close, for example, the innovation gap? And also, you will have seen, and I alluded to it, how do we actually simplify some of the administrative burden on our companies, especially SMEs? To do that, you will, I think, Zeynep, you mentioned the AI Act that is coming into play. There's still a number of implementing acts that will have to be or published. But basically, it's extremely, it's changing the way how we start using AI in Europe, and especially in the public sector, because many of the solutions used in the public sector will fall under the high-risk solutions, so they will have to be registered and assessed in a proper way. But at the same time, the Commission is coming out with quite a number of initiatives that would still enable innovation with AI in Europe. So you will have heard the AI innovation package in the last Commission, or the pledge to invest in applying AI. You have seen the AI continent strategy, which tries to make Europe the AI continent through a number of initiatives. For example, we'll have the data union strategy later this year. We'll also have the Apply AI initiative, which is identifying concrete areas and sectors where AI solutions could be prioritized or could have a great benefit. And rest assured, one area will be on environment and sustainability, and another area will be in the public sector. So keep an eye on this. I think before the end of the year for sure it will be out, but probably even Q3. And then how you may have seen the EU startup and scale-up strategy come out. And then some of the focus areas for environmental policy for this Commission, I've already said: clean industry, industrial emissions reduction, circularity, nature-based solutions, and the water resilience strategy came out. So if I try to kind of summarize, where are we going? What are the kind of enablers that we may need? And allow me for this, but this one comes from my digital past and background. So I focused on some of the key digital enablers that we may need, but starting with a policy. And I think it's great that we have people here who perhaps know more on the green or more on the digital government, but definitely from academia and from civil service here, because what we need is the right policy framework that aligns the objectives of both. We also need to invest in the right infrastructure. So what is that digital infrastructure that we need for the green transition? The UNEP, so the UN Environmental Protection Agency, has put forward a very interesting study on this, and you may see also similar ideas coming out of the reports of Maria Mazzucato and some other former European Commission colleagues on the EU stack. What is it? What are the kind of perhaps digital public infrastructure elements that we may need to actually spur and go beyond just small, sporadic pilots and good ideas to actually make a transformational change. Then, of course, what we need is data, innovation, and probably investing in innovation, skills and education, and public-private partnership on bringing together the objectives of both sides, and then consumer or citizen engagement and monitoring. So allow me to just put a few ideas out there, and then happy to brainstorm further on these. So indeed, if we are, I took this picture from the UN report, but is there like there's a lot of discussion on whether or not what is this digital public infrastructure, modular, essentially open standard or open source based solutions put together to create the infrastructure for maybe some of the basic public services, but it could also be for environment. Well, what would that be? What are the basic, really hardcore infrastructure or hardware? And then based on that, what should be the, some of the already modularly available solutions? How do I identify myself? How do I don't know, in government context, how do I make my payments? How do I exchange data? And then perhaps on top of that, some applications like the digital product passport or personal carbon tracking or automated compliance solutions. I mentioned that the second element that we absolutely need is data. Who I spoke to earlier, yeah, the two gentlemen there about data sharing and data collaboration mechanisms. As you know, the Commission has put forward the data strategy, and with the data strategy, the idea was that we create a common European data space starting by different sectors. So there is because perhaps the data sharing and perhaps the business models of that data sharing may be different in different domains. So there's an emphasis on, sharing health data. And in fact, in the health data space, there is even a legislation on how you share secondary data, because it's obviously a quite prone to privacy challenges. You have industrial data sharing, you have agriculture, but you also have, for example, the Green Deal data space, which is in its embryonic version. There's projects and some initiatives, but the idea would be is that we go from, and this was the idea of the data space, we go away from the idea that government just publishes data in the open and somebody will use it. Because that we tried with the Inspire data regime, we tried with open data regime. And apart from the fact that now there's also questions on what is all the data that we're supposed to, because of the geopolitical situation, should be published. We didn't necessarily see all the innovation that we thought, because that was coming as a as a top-down decision of, okay, this is the supply of data and you use it. Some of the data that we recognized or the users are identified as necessary was not necessarily open and public data. Could be public, but sensitive data, could be private data, could be even citizen data. But then how do you share it? And the gentleman there will probably explain to us what are the incentives for a company to share that data. But we've also done some of that discussion, by the way, together with the city of Amsterdam and some other cities. What are the kind of data that a city would need, and how would you actually get that data from a private company? Would it be for a price? Would it be for a win-win situation? And how do you frame that? How do you actually do that? So we're trying to look at that also in the context of the Green Deal data space. What is the data that would be essentially needed? It should be much more demand-driven, not the supply-driven. What are the kind of use cases that would need that data? And how do we ensure that that data is exchanged? And it's basically a secure exchange of data under certain conditions agreed by the members of this data space, and then perhaps moderated by a data intermediary to foster some kind of a network effect. So the more data is shared, the more value people will see in it, and then again, more data is shared and so on. So the way we go about it is that in our case, but in all the data spaces cases, that we identify a framework we have funded projects to identify a framework for that specific sector and a blueprint and some governance structure. And then we're trying now to implement it with a sort of implementation phase. In our case, and I'll come to that in a moment, it's called this, it was the GREAT project. I don't know, maybe some of you were even involved. And now we're working with so-called SAGE project. So the Data Space for Sustainable Green Europe. It will have 10 pilots in the next run for 3 years, just started this year. And these are the pilots on the right-hand side. And we're trying to think like, okay, so what would be the future of such a data space? And obviously governance is a huge element of it. So who would govern this? What would be the way to go forward? And then I said innovation, so I just wanted to mention all the elements of the AI continent. But again, if you want to discuss it more in the depth, I'm happy to explore, like what are all the possibilities. There's a lot of emphasis now on Gen AI, obviously. And we also identified quite a number of use cases that AI can support for the green transition. I picked up here 4, obviously monitoring and forecasting that I had mentioned earlier, but beyond that, there's also resource efficiency. So for what I said earlier, the water, resource or soil efficiency and energy efficiency. Another area is accelerating green solutions, and really it's something that we're trying to understand, what is the value of data for data products in environment, and then increasing the productivity of those that need to comply with the legislation. These are just some ideas. We're trying to help administrations build their capacity to benefit from all this, so there's some enablers related to AI, like digital innovation hubs and testing facilities and many others. But then there's also some funding. So if you're interested, I'm happy to also expand on those. And then identify what could be the innovation on top of that digital infrastructure. So is it a new large language model? Is it like a foundational model? Or is it a whatever like modularly generic enough reusable solution like a digital product passport that could then spur this digital infrastructure for environment. Last but not least, the skills is an issue. I here again just quote a few of those studies from the European Investment Bank, but also from the World Economic Forum, that indeed skills is a problem. And I think what is really nice is that universities are engaged in these discussions and to identify. We've already done the curriculum for the digital skills for the civil servants. There is also a curriculum ongoing for the green transition, and how do we bring the two together? So just a few key messages before I conclude or I finish is that I think it's important, and I'm really happy to see that this is a topic again on how do we go towards the digital and green transition together. And recognizing the synergies, but the trade-offs as well. Sustainability is an integrated approach, so I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. I graduated as an economist, and that was really, at the time, not at all. The ecological boundaries was not even thought of. Then how do we leverage real-time data? I think that's something that we will more and more be exploring also in the Commission and facilitating the use of that real-time data from IoT, but also other means. And then I think what's really interesting is to align the public and private sector objectives and policies. So I think we and you as academics or civil servants, we have a role to play here to try and shape the policies of the future appropriately. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I leave here a few dates for some of our upcoming workshops in relation to the digitally powered green transition. So the next one is the first one is on the 25th of June. It's online. There will be 2 other online workshops and one in September in Brussels. So more than welcome. Would be happy to welcome you there. And with that, I thank you for your attention.